Welcome to Hotter Than Ever, where we uncover the unconscious rules we've been following, we break those rules, and we find a new path to being freer, happier, sexier, and more self-expressed. I'm your host, Erin Keating. If you are new here, welcome to the Hotter Than Ever podcast. I am so glad you found us, and I hope you get lit up by the conversation we have today. If you've been listening for a while, welcome back. It's always great to see you. Well, I can't see you, but I can feel you, and I appreciate you more than you know. Last week, I launched the Hotter Than Ever Substack newsletter to dig deeper into the topics we cover on this show. I'm so excited about it. Thanks to those of you who have signed up already. And for those of you who have not, you can go to hotterthanever.substack.com and sign up for free. We'll be publishing it every other week. Today, I talked to Michelle Roberts. Michelle is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. She's a psychotherapist and a professor whose work helps women discover how past trauma influences their current relationships. I think we all need this conversation. She is an expert on the modern epidemic of narcissistic abuse, which we will get into, and her research on empathy has been presented at the American Psychological Association. She also serves as a contributor on the Oxygen Network's Mastermind of Murder, where she provides insight on dark personalities. I know true crime is a big thing for women our age. This conversation literally blew my mind. As a woman who has had more than her fair share of experience with narcissistic men, I related to so much of what Michelle talked about with regard to our coping strategies in dealing with them, and also the neurobiological impact and psychological impact of CPTSD, which is complex PTSD. And that is the result of ongoing trauma. So if you are in a long-term relationship or a parental relationship or some kind of close relationship with a narcissist, with any pathological degree, you might have CPTSD and your behavior in your nervous system may have gotten wired for a certain way of reacting to life and the world. That is somewhat maladaptive and can be treated. So one thing I like to do on this podcast is to help women know ourselves and to get better and to get the right kind of help when we need it. And that is why I like to talk to brilliant experts in the mental health space like Michelle. Take a listen. Michelle Roberts is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, psychotherapist, and professor whose work helps women discover how past trauma influences their current relationships. I think we all need this conversation. She is an expert on the modern epidemic of narcissistic abuse, which we will get into, and her research on empathy has been presented at the American Psychological Association. She also serves as a contributor on the Oxygen Network's Mastermind of Murder, where she provides insight on dark personalities. Welcome to Hotter Than Ever, Michelle.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. We hear the word narcissism thrown around in our culture, on Instagram, everywhere where women gather, right? And I think we don't know what it really means. And I just am excited to have this conversation so we can really understand when someone's being a dick and then versus when they're a narcissist. Because I think there's a meaningful distinction. And I think you have some profound insights into why some of us are attracted to narcissists and why we find ourselves kind of repeating some of the patterns of our childhood in our adult relationships.
Right. Well, let's start there. So, what's a narcissist? I got into this field. Oh my gosh, this field feels like it coincides a little bit with those earlier days of Instagram, right? Because it was the first time that people were getting together and talking about shared experiences in this new way. And I found myself, like so many of us, kind of reading those little squares and some new information coming out and starting those communities forming in those very early days. And I just can't leave it at Instagram, right? I have to go get a PhD in all of it to understand it. She
Yeah, so
tells you a little.
you were doing something totally different, right? You were a
Yeah.
journalist.
Yeah, I was a journalist for many years. It's all I ever wanted to be, was to tell stories, tell the truth, try
Mm,
to get at the root of the truth, because my childhood, as I now understand it, was really impacted by narcissism and all of the distortions that that can bring.
mm.
So, if I do my own pop chair psychology on myself, getting out, nailing down the truth was something that felt like a really worthwhile purpose. And
Because truth was elusive
felt
in
like
your
that.
childhood? Yeah.
It felt like that. Or that
Mm,
it was always shifting,
mm,
right, to kind of meet the needs of the moment.
mm.
So, um, yeah, I was a journalist for many years, loved it. I got my first master's at Northwestern and promptly went to the Chicago Sun-Times, where I covered crime. And,
Did you have an interest in crime?
that's what usually kind of the entry level beat that,
Interesting, because
you
there's
know,
a lot of it,
there's a lot of it. And there
especially in
certainly.
Chicago.
Yep, especially then back in the 90s, it was the first year that we surpassed New York as the kind of per capita murder capital, and
Mazel tov.
covered all of that. And, as I went on in my career, of course, branched out into other things, but always fascinated, like so many of us are, about how some people can do things, right, without seemingly a flicker
Right.
of that internal stuff that we all think we all have.
The morality?
Morality, empathy,
Yeah,
just the stuff that makes us human.
yeah,
And I think that's why, there's this vast fascination with all of these crime shows, because we all wonder about it, right? What could really create that? And so what I've learned over the years is there's this spectrum, right, of personality disorders that kind of starts with, let's just start with narcissistic traits, that
yeah.
goes all the way up through pathological narcissism, all the way up to the top of the scale of psychopathy. You can be a narcissist without being a psychopath, but you really can't be a psychopath without being a narcissist.
Okay, explain that to me.
Yeah. It's
What
it's all.
what is yeah, so what is the textbook definition of
Mhm.
narcissism?
Well, it's one that seems to be in flux even in the DSM, but it's a constellation
And the
of.
DSM, for people who are listening
Oh,
who aren't so hip to psychological stuff,
thank you.
is the physician's desk reference book that lists, like, every psychological disorder.
Yes, yes. And, what we know as just narcissism is a fairly narrow kind of list of descriptors, including someone who is grandiose, likes to have all eyes on them, really sees the world through only as it relates to them. And
Mm,
so, anything that kind of gets in the way of that is expendable, so to speak. Lack of empathy is another common trait.
mhm,
But that doesn't mean like zero empathy, right? It can just mean diminished empathy. So NPD is a pretty serious personality disorder, and then up through psychopathy, which is the traits of, a psychopath. And that's really someone with such deleted empathy that
mm,
really there's there's really very little that a personality structure like that will do or seek out to do unless it serves them in some way.
mhm,
And so, I mean, at some level of the spectrum, those things become very blurry. And, personality disorders, like from borderline, we hear about that, borderline personality disorder, all of those tend to have overlapping symptoms.
mhm,
So it's no doubt then, when anybody kind of reads that list of things and they see maybe their boyfriend or their mother or someone like that on that list, they think, I've got a narcissist on my hands.
mhm.
they may or may not. They may have somebody who's going through a really rough period where their empathy is just a little depleted, but it can potentially go back up when the stress is off, right?
Mm.
Or all the way up to these really pervasive personality disorders, which is really what I think we want to focus on. So, a person with what's known as pathological narcissism, at first they kind of come off as that Prince Charming, right?
Oh,
Attentive.
this is love bombing, right?
Yes, attentive, caring, and empathetic, but with a real narcissist versus someone with just some traits, or is just as you said, being a jerk. Is that what you said?
I think maybe I said dick, but yeah.
I think so, but being a dick.
Yeah.
But with a real a person with a real problem with this, that's, this empathy is just a front. Once they feel like you're hooked into the relationship, maybe after a big commitment like marriage or, buying a house together, they flip the script and suddenly they're cold, cruel, and dismissive, right?
Mm.
And the sad part is they exploit the fact that we expect everyone to play fair and be kind. So while they're secretly being abusive being abusive to everyone else, they seem like a real stand-up guy or girl, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it incredibly tough for the person on the receiving end of it to seek help, let alone even figure out what's going on, right? Because it just isn't obvious. It's concealed behind this mask of normalcy.
Oof. I
Yeah.
mean, this is really tricky stuff,
Hmm.
right? Like,
It
you could
is.
fall in love with somebody,
Hmm.
you could believe all the things they say. You might
Hmm.
see some flickers of like, oh, this person's pretty self-involved or whatever, but
Hmm.
that's like, that's their ego and like they're,
Hmm.
they're out there trying to be something in the world. Like they're talking about themselves all the time because, they're trying to achieve things. And I mean, there's so many ways that the traits that you're describing can masquerade as
Hmm.
normal or even like approvable, socially approvable.
Hmm.
And then the notion that like once you are trapped in a
Hmm.
relationship with this person, then like the gloves come off behind
Hmm.
closed doors. This is very upsetting. And your PhD
Hmm.
thesis, and I just want to read it out loud, the title of it. It's called
Okay.
Moth to a Flame: An
Hmm.
Investigation of the Personality Traits and Early Life Trauma Histories of Women who have
Hmm.
survived adult relationships with men with
Hmm.
pathological narcissism. So this is like
Yeah.
what happened to us as
Hmm.
girls that made us wired to be attracted to these men
Hmm.
and and then survive these relationships. I'm assuming that a lot of the
Exactly.
women that you might have talked to came out the other side and were reflecting on this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just to let you know, I mean, often when we're doing our dissertation, kind of seeking people to participate, it's sometimes really hard to get 100 people,
Yeah.
right? My study has incredible statistical validity because over 3,000 women participated. And I ultimately used 2,000 full surveys, and this was an hour-long interview, right? So, I mean, an hour-long survey with some follow-up work. So, I mean, that's an incredible commitment to a piece of research by
But
just individual people, which kind of tells you, how much women who've lived through that want to be understood and understand what happened to them.
well, and also maybe that it wasn't so hard to find a lot of people who have had this experience.
Hmm. It
That's
wasn't.
really that's really
Yeah.
profound.
Hmm.
And I can see wanting to talk about it and wanting to get into it and wanting to share your story because this does not feel uncommon to me.
Hmm.
Like, why women choose bad men or why are we attracted to bad boys or whatever the
Hmm.
pop culture like, Harlequin version of it or Hallmark
Hmm.
Channel version of it is, like there is profound shit that happened to us as girls
Hmm.
that made us receptive to this as women.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean,
Like what? Like what happened to us? What What can I
Well,
protect my children from?
well, a lot of it, so I took that on point blank in my research. And also, we do research, and I mean, for me, it was always kind of coming out of the place where, what I knew, right? And I was born to teenagers in the 70s. So that
Mm,
was no cakewalk, right?
right.
But still I got lucky cuz I spent a bunch of my early years with my grandparents. And but when I had to go back and live with my mom, things were tough. And kind of just getting back into this, the research part, you know, what my research found is that women who wind up in relationships with narcissists had were 4 times more likely to have what we call adverse childhood experiences. Right. So 4 times the average. So the
Mm,
average child, just if you norm it across the entire population, the average is a little bit over 1 adverse childhood experiences per person. If you look at women who have the women in my survey, they had 4. That was the
mhm,
average, right? Just the average. So many
right.
had more than that. So, I mean, and adverse childhood experiences can run the gamut from my parents were divorced to um, I endured very serious psychological and, you know, physical, sexual abuse as a kid.
Mhm, mhm.
Runs the gamut. So, we're much more likely to have those early life experiences. And I mean, my research didn't specifically look at this, but if you look at, you know, ACEs scores, I mean, and just what goes into, that measure, I would imagine that a lot of those kiddos had narcissists as parents as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
What God, it's so intense to talk
Hmm.
about these classifications because
Hmm.
there's so many degrees of everything,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Right.
you could have a parent who was controlling
Hmm.
or who was, um,
Hmm.
self-centered or who prioritized themselves and their own wants and needs over, taking care of you and taking care of what
Hmm.
you needed. There's like that, and then there's all the worse stuff, that is on the spectrum, and all of it kind of counts towards how we get wired for future relationships.
Right. That's absolutely it. So the women who come to my private practice, really, they're often highly successful, intelligent, assertive, right? They're not someone you would look at and say, "Oh, she had a horrible childhood," or, but they find themselves, puzzled over their continued entanglement with this kind of personality structure.
Mm,
And they really struggle to understand why they got into these relationships, but not only that, why they find it tough to leave or even to stop thinking about their narcissistic partners after they do, right? So, contrary to some kind of beliefs out there in popular culture, but not only that, some early researchers and clinicians really put forth this idea that it was our personality traits that were the primary reason that we get involved with narcissists.
what do you mean?
Um, just like really outgoing, not afraid, bold, wanting a partner who um, was kind of
Larger than life kind
larger
of
than
thing?
life. Right,
Right.
right.
Life of the party, lights up the room.
Hmm.
You can see I have
All of that.
a little familiarity with this
Hmm.
personality type.
Yeah. And some of that early research even stated that it wasn't childhood trauma, which I thought didn't make any kind of logical
Isn't
sense.
everything based on our childhood?
I
All
think
of our adult decisions and relationships sort of have some foundation in our
mhm,
childhood.
mhm. The research strongly supports that, and that's my personal experience. Um, but my research did show of those 2,000 women that early life trauma was the significant factor, right?
Mm,
So in this study, um, a history of childhood trauma was prevalent and strongly predictive of not only having been in the relationship, but also the intense symptoms of complex trauma that usually followed it.
Let's talk about that a little bit too,
Yeah.
because I have started to hear this term CPTSD,
Mm-hmm.
um, complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and when you and I talked, you described it as being as having like lifelong ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if you could describe for the listeners like what it feels like to have CPTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we think PTSD is like, oh, well, I went to Iraq and I came back and I was all fucked up. And,
Mm-hmm.
here are all the symptoms. Or, um, I lived through some traumatizing experience or a death or, something. And,
Mm-hmm.
but this is more subtle than that and more
Mm-hmm.
complicated. And so
Mm-hmm.
I really love to dig into this.
Yeah. So complex PTSD is a type of it's what come up to describe the PTSD that flows from long-term trauma. It's not just single event trauma or going to war trauma. It's trauma that often, but not always, starts in childhood, and it's almost always relational, right, in nature. So it comes out of child abuse, out of domestic violence. Um, I guess you know kidnapping, that kind of trauma where a person can escape and it goes on for a prolonged period of time. So there's tons
Mm.
of different kind of ways that complex trauma can start. Another word that often describes it is like developmental trauma that kind of happens as we're developing and interrupts that development. So basically the the new we're talking about it a lot more, but
Mhm.
actually the idea was introduced by Dr. Judith Herman back in 1988 to address these symptoms of long-term trauma. And her idea was just that PTSD doesn't really cover all of the symptomology
Mm.
that she was seeing in CPTSD. And so it's considered a more severe form of PTSD and characterized by 5 key features that set it apart:
Okay.
emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self abandonment, a harsh inner critic, and social anxiety.
Oh, so like how women feel in general every day, all the time, walking around in the world. I mean, this is all
Mm-hmm.
fucking normal.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I like. All the overachieving women
Mm-hmm.
I know have
Mm-hmm.
all
Me
of this
too.
stuff.
Me too. Right?
Does
Um,
that mean we're all walking around with CPTSD and trying to overcompensate for our childhoods?
I think a lot more of us are than we have ever
Mm,
realized.
fuck.
I also think that there's degrees of this, right? There's these can be things that happen to us at all times, but CPTSD is more just of a pervasive kind of way of being in these symptoms without even really realizing it. One
Okay.
thing
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but I wanna
no.
hear this list again because I think
Hmm.
it was every single one I was like, "Uh-huh,
Hmm.
and, like, for
Hmm.
myself." So,
Hmm.
yes, let's hear it again and let's have it really like, we could spend a little time with each one
Hmm.
'cause if the listeners are recognizing themselves in this list, like, I wanna honor that and and I don't wanna diagnose them on the podcast, but I feel like, wow,
Hmm.
this is deep.
Yeah. Emotional flashbacks.
So what is that?
Okay, emotional
Yeah.
flashbacks in particular are a prominent hallmark. Um, these are sudden and intense emotional regressions to past trauma that we might not even be realizing that we're having, right? We think of PTSD as flashbacks, and we know we're in a flashback.
Right. I'm back in
With
Nam. Yeah.
right, we hear the firework and our whole body goes,
Right.
but we pretty much know what's going on. This is different. The emotional flashbacks kind of float in more like mood states, than they and they feel more just like, oh, I wake up and I'm really depressed. I feel like all of a sudden very small and vulnerable, right? And these are just they're intensely disturbing regressions. You might also call them amygdala hijackings. Your brain is literally being hijacked to those overwhelming feeling states of either your childhood abandonment or previous instances of abuse.
Mm.
And when you're stuck in an emotional flashback, fear, shame, and depression can just dominate your experience. So these are some common
Mm.
experiences of being in emotional flashback. You might feel like little, fragile, and helpless. Everything might feel just too hard. Life is too scary. Being seen might feel excruciatingly vulnerable all of a sudden, or your battery seems to be dead. In the worst flashbacks, it can feel like apocalyptic, right? It can just feel like you're shutting down, a panic, full on panic feeling. So when
Mm.
we're trapped in these flashbacks, you really are reliving the worst emotional times of your past. Everything feels not only overwhelming but also confusing, especially because there's rarely any of those visual components.
And does something trigger this? Or
Hmm.
like for me, sometimes just like a dark cloud floats over
Yep.
and it just feels
Hmm.
like, oh fuck, everything feels really dark
Hmm.
today. Everything feels negative. All my thoughts are like not good enough, not good enough.
Hmm.
Like and I had a lot of that as a kid and feeling small and powerless. Um and so maybe that's a form of emotional flashback.
Hmm. It is.
Mm.
It definitely is.
Mm.
Um, you'd asked what triggers it. Sometimes we can figure that out and sometimes we can't.
Mm.
I had one client once who had a narcissistic mother, incredibly painful growing up. And she had, cut her mother off a decade ago.
Mm.
Um, but noticed that every now and then she would sneak on and take a look at her mother's Facebook account,
Mm.
right? Even though, and then just kind of have these feelings. And so we did EMDR on it, which is a form of therapy for PTSD I'll talk about later. But we did EMDR on it, and immediately the memory came up of her as just a small toddler walking around, you know, her childhood home. It was empty. She was left alone a lot.
Mm.
And she immediately knew that the times that she would go and try to locate her mother,
Mm.
even now, all these years later,
Mm.
was when the house was quiet, when the kids weren't home, right? When her husband wasn't there.
Mm.
And so for her, that emotional flashback that resulted right in this behavior was was feeling alone in the house,
Mm.
right? So she wouldn't have known that. She just knew of the sudden panicky feeling and then the going and looking at the social media.
Right.
But therapy can help us kind of unwind some of that stuff.
Right. And understand kind of where it's coming from and then sort of
Yeah.
take the charge out of it as much as we can.
Yeah.
Mm. Okay. So that's emotional flashbacks. That's one of the five.
Hmm.
And the second one was what?
Toxic shame, this inner critic, right? We internalize those messages that came from our childhood, but also, right, our narcissistically abusive partners. Even though we know cognitively it's not true, it nevertheless still feels true.
Yeah.
And so, what happens is maybe we're in an emotional flashback, feeling a little low. Then that toxic shame comes in
Mm.
and starts revving up that inner critic. And before you know it, we've re traumatized ourselves with our own words and what we tell ourselves about
Mm.
ourselves that we cognitively know isn't true, but
Right.
it's nevertheless how we feel. I always say from the head up, you know what's what, but from chin down, somatically, it feels true that I am worthless, that I wouldn't be feeling depressed right now if I, wasn't such a terrible person or if I had done better in therapy or whatever. I mean, it's just this big, ugly morass.
Oh my God.
And
I mean, I will tell you an example
Mhm.
of something that happens to me.
Yeah.
If I ever feel like I'm gonna get, like, caught in a lie or
Mhm.
caught out and, like,
Mhm.
made a public example of for doing something wrong, and
Mhm.
in what world does that actually really happen in adult life? It doesn't unless you've
Rarely.
committed a crime, and you're
Right.
being prosecuted. In
Mhm.
general, probably not.
Mhm.
But I have this experience of, like, a physical hot flash of shame going from
Mhm.
my feet up to the top of my head. Like, I could feel
Mhm.
heat and it
Mhm.
physically rolling up my body, and it hasn't happened in a long time, but
Mhm.
I remember one time in my last job, I felt like I was gonna get in trouble for something. I'm
Mhm.
like a grown-up fucking successful executive, and
Right.
I'm having this
Mhm.
child reaction that is in my body, and I can't do
Mhm.
anything about it. And I
Mhm.
was like, "This feels old. This feels fucking prehistoric."
Mhm.
Like, this is coming from when I was a kid and I got caught, with how many cookies I ate in the morning, and I was told how many I ate, and those were counted, and
Yep.
I was made to feel
Shamed.
bad about it because that was
Mhm.
supposedly gonna make me not be fat. It's like,
Yeah.
I oh my god, that gets lodged in your body.
Yeah, it does. I mean, a way that a lot of my clients, what you're describing could even be, bordering on a vagal response, right? So, and that's when I always, for me, it feels like my heart has fallen into my butt.
Oof.
It is this intense panic that has no place in reality.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, my body is doing this and it's having a profound impact,
Yeah.
just on me in that moment. And that's true for so many of my clients.
Mm.
They Almost everyone I work with describes just this pervasive ball of pit fear in their
Oh, yeah.
stomach that rarely leaves. And it like one woman is worried about, finances, but there's no reason for her to be worried about finances. But whenever she goes to the mailbox, her body feels this intense nervousness. What if there's a bill in there? There probably will be a bill in
Yeah,
there.
and you
There's been
pay
a
it.
bill in
Right.
right, but it's that ball of fear that makes no sense. So we all have
Mm.
our different versions of this. And it
Wow.
gets intense in that we think, why am I still feeling this way? And it creates, that toxic shame and that cycle that goes on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
So
no.
that's why it's really important to really understand that if we have CPTSD or not,
Right.
because often it masquerades as other stuff and we get misdiagnosed with everything from depression to, you know, borderline personality disorder to just general anxiety. And those treatments generally only do superficial work. What
Mm.
we really need to do is the work of trauma care, real trauma care. And that's how you're going to clear up those symptoms.
Mm.
SSRIs might take off the edge, for 20 years, but they're really not going to ever fully eradicate the symptoms without the trauma work if it's CPTSD that's on board.
Right. Right, and also, this is not a psychedelics podcast, but it is a topic that I like to talk about.
Me too.
Yes, and I know that you work, with psychedelics to help with healing,
Mhm.
and we'll get into that when we get into kind of how people who are feeling this stuff
Mhm.
uh, can get help.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so we have the emotional flashbacks.
Mhm.
We have what was the last one called?
The last one that I just talked about was toxic shame.
Toxic shame. Okay.
Hmm.
Then what was the next?
Um, the next one was inner critic.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
I I I don't know anyone who has ever accomplished anything in life, even people who haven't accomplished anything. I don't
Hmm.
know anyone who is a woman who
Hmm.
doesn't have a
Hmm.
very loud inner critic.
Right. And that doesn't mean that if you have that, you have CPTSD,
Right.
right?
No.
Right. A harsh inner critic it's part of this kind of overall schema of, you know, symptoms that we're talking about. Another one that kind of plays into this but isn't on this list is emotional dysregulation, right? It's just what you described, right? That feeling of hot intensity from your feet up.
Yeah.
That causes you to feel a little bit emotionally unstable in the
Yeah.
moment, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of show that outwardly in to varying degrees and in different situations, right? But
Mm.
emotional dysregulation is another really important feature. So there's a difference between, you know, being hard on ourselves internally and having it completely upend what feels like our world, and, you know, that, you know, flowing through our body in these somatic
Right.
sensations.
Right.
I mean, there's a difference. We
Yeah.
can that harsh inner critic for someone with CPTSD can set off kind of this cascade of, you know, responses and behaviors, and emotional dysregulation that is it's beyond just, you know, us
Being hard on
motivating
yourself.
ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what does a regular inner critic sound like versus a harsh inner critic?
Well, I mean, they might be saying similar things, right?
Mhm.
But our
Mhm.
response to it, I think it's
Okay.
easier for someone without CPTSD to say, "Okay, get over it. Yeah, I'm going to just barrel through this." Whereas someone with CPTSD can feel that harsh inner critic so, you know, loud that it causes us to kind of go into a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn
Mhm.
response, right?
Wait, what's the last one?
Fawn.
I've never heard this. Okay. I've heard fight, flight, or freeze.
Okay. Well,
But fawn, really, this ties into your work at Oxygen and the crime
mhm,
shows. Okay, let's
mhm.
say tell me what this is.
Well, the fawn response, you know, if we think of fight, it's fighting to stay safe,
Yeah.
right? Flight is, you know, running away
Mhm.
to stay safe. How that looks in everyday life is workaholism, busyness, right?
Yep, that's me.
Um, a freeze response is play dead to stay
Mhm.
safe.
Mhm.
It looks like dissociation.
Mhm.
Many women are caught in a level of dissociation almost perpetually that they don't even realize until they've started doing trauma work. Freeze can just be kind of just shut down, scrolling on
Going
the
through the
phone.
motions. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so freezing to stay safe, playing dead to stay safe,
right.
and fawn is um, taking care of being what's the word I want to look for? Um, Subservient or um, agreeing to stay safe. Yes, I agree with you, right? Or yes, you're right. You know, it's kind of the codependency part of the four F's.
Well,
So
and that's
fight,
where you
flight,
sell
freeze,
yourself
and
out,
fawn.
right? That's where you sell
Yeah,
yourself out. That's
self
where you
abandonment.
abandon yourself, which is on your list.
Yeah.
I mean, this is so important
Hmm.
for women to know about
Hmm.
because I think we're trained to abandon ourselves in so many different ways in order to
Hmm.
just get through in the world. I agree
Hmm.
with you. I really do like that band. Like
Hmm.
it's like,
Yeah.
I sure I want to go to this place that you want to go to, even though inside you're going, I fucking hate that place.
Hmm.
I don't want to go to that place, but it'll make everything better if I
Hmm.
just say yes. I don't want to cause a problem. Let's not have a fight. Like, let me be conciliatory. I'll be generous and kind in
Hmm.
this instance so that the harmony is kept. So I don't upset the apple cart. So I
Hmm.
don't push that invisible button that I know is there that's just waiting to be
Hmm.
triggered.
And what does society do to us when we push that button, right? So there's a tremendous like pressure on all fronts, not just interpersonally, but kind of, you know, in the meta for women to fawn. That's what's expected. So, and this is what kind of gets to another piece of my research. So I'm sure that you've seen on social media all of this discussion about, you know, narcissists are evil, and their victims are empaths, right? So it kind of
Mm,
created this good versus evil kind of dynamic out in the schema. And I wanted to look at that because so many narcissistic abuse survivors kind of identify as empaths.
mm-hmm.
And I just thought it was worth looking at.
Yeah.
Um, so I put in a really well known empathy scale into my dissertation just to see what it would come back as. And um, it was interesting because these women did score a little bit higher, right, than the norms as empathizers, but it wasn't as much as I might have expected it to be. It became clear that empathy alone probably didn't explain why these women were drawn to narcissistic individuals. There's this theory suggesting that women with heightened empathy might engage in pathological altruism, essentially being harmed by their own compassionate nature, right? They fall into what's termed an empathy trap, where their capacity to empathize deeply makes it hard for them to grasp that others might lack this empathy. I think it makes
No.
sense. You don't think so? That's just a
Well,
theory.
yeah, I mean, sure. You
Mhm.
think you're so empathetic and therefore other
Yeah.
people have that too. But
Mhm.
also, being super empathetic protects you
Yes.
because you're the
Mhm.
person who understands the pathological person.
Mhm.
You're the person who really gets how much
Mhm.
pain they're in or how
Oh, yeah.
difficult things are for them
Mhm.
or, like all the bad things that
Mhm.
happen to them that make them act the bad way that they act.
Mhm.
Like,
Well,
I just know from my own life, like, I have been super
mhm.
empathetic to men who didn't treat me well.
Mhm.
And, and that was a way that I sold myself out, where it was like,
Mhm.
well, he went through so much as a kid, or
Mhm. Mhm.
he really struggles with blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, but meanwhile, like, what am I experiencing?
Mhm. Mhm.
It's all focused on him and making sure that those behaviors don't fucking impact me.
Right. So I think there's a lot more research to be done just on this concept of empathy as
Mm.
it relates to this whole thing. But I really felt when I got those numbers back that the concept of the fawn response really might come into play here, right? So that's that trauma response where a person tries to please or appease others to avoid conflict, criticism, rejection, you know, pain. And we often see it in women, anyone really but particularly women who have experienced that early life trauma as a way of coping with overwhelming stress or danger, right? And this response can sometimes be mistaken for empathy and
Mm.
as both can involve kind of that heightened sensitivity to others' needs.
Mm.
But the fawn response is a survival strategy rooted in fear and a need for safety,
Mm.
right? So
I've
so it's
noticed,
just
yeah, I've noticed some successful
mhm,
women in the workplace
mhm,
where they make it their job to become the confidant of the powerful man, the
mhm,
person who will be in service of the powerful man.
mhm,
Um, and and you could see them working that as a strategy for their own success, but also their own survival in a hostile male environment, like
mhm,
which a lot of workplaces are. Like,
mhm,
that is so interesting that that
mhm,
actually can come from that skill set can come from
mhm,
learned behaviors in your own fucked up childhood.
mhm. Yeah. It's interesting. These are defense strategies
That's
that
right.
are often we're not even fully aware until we really kind of start digging into our own work that we're doing these. So while it might look, like an actual strategy, it it might just be kind of an automatic response for a lot of people
Mm.
without even fully realizing that they're doing that.
Right. Right. Sure. It's just
Mhm,
like how you
mhm,
do things.
Mhm.
There was this quote on in your materials that I would just love to read.
Yeah.
Um, and you said when most people think of trauma, they see war, natural disasters, car
Mm.
wrecks, but the most difficult traumas are inflicted by those we expect to love and protect us. Abuse or neglect as a child, deception in an adult relationship, and interpersonal violations are the ones that do the most damage, causing lasting changes in the areas of the brain responsible for regulating emotion, thought, and memory. This kind of
Mhm.
trauma causes us to question the truths of our very being. I thought that was so succinctly and beautifully put.
Thank you.
And yeah, I mean, and that is like, is that tied to like this notion of gaslighting where, you know,
Mhm.
you're just trying to
Mhm.
survive?
Mhm. We think of gaslighting, right, as this interpersonal, you know, it's an interpersonal back and forth form of communication where one person is trying to, where it's observable in the words of it, and you can, see that one person is trying to harm the other one by being deceptive. But what most people don't really understand is that people who live through that type of abuse, gaslighting in particular, become actually neurologically impaired,
Mm,
right? And that's part of what keeps us, in these relationships. It's not just, so over time, these repeated emotional injuries actually shrink the hippocampus in our brains, responsible for memory and learning, while enlarging our amygdalas, which house those primitive emotions such as fear, grief, guilt, envy, and shame. Right? So, in other words, the longer we have to stay in relationships like that, and think about, our childhoods, we don't often get out till we're 18 years old, right? Or a
right.
narcissistically abusive relationship where there's kids, and, maybe we're stuck in it for 15, 20 years, right?
Hmm.
The longer we're there, the more deterioration we can expect of our hippocampus and our brain function. And this neurological process leads to feelings of confusion, cognitive dissonance,
Mm.
right? He's good, he's bad, and abuse amnesia. And that's a
What's
really
abuse
important.
amnesia?
Abuse amnesia is where we essentially forget all of the bad things that have happened to us. There's many overlapping theories in psychology about abuse amnesia. Another one is called betrayal blindness, and it's where
Mm.
it is less stressful on the person and the person's brain and somatic responses to forget all of the abuse that's happened and just stay in the memories of the good stuff. So children, actually, we develop that as children because we have our survival depends on staying in relationship with our parents.
That's right.
So when there's so much, you know, terror and horror to look at, our brains automatically shift over to, viewing that parent as loving and focusing on the times that they were. And so that's why you see little kids who are horribly abused, black and blue from head to toe,
Mm.
crying to stay with their mothers
Mm.
or their fathers, right? Wanting to go back, longing to go back. And it's just this, the brain, it's just really an incredible instrument, and it does these things to protect us. But when we're adults, you know, that doesn't serve us anymore. As kids,
No.
we might even make some arguments that it did serve us, right?
Well, it
To
helps you get
stay,
through. It helps you get
yeah,
through, it helps you get fed, it helps you get housed, like
yeah, helps you stay alive.
yeah,
Hmm. But
yeah,
as adults, that it helps to explain why it's really hard to get out of one of those relationships.
yeah.
The number one symptom that I treat is craving for the narcissist after she's left, right?
Mm.
She knows that this is bad for her, but there's still this longing that can permeate her experience for years after.
Yeah.
So it's tough, and it really requires working with clinicians who understand, well, complex PTSD, and narcissistic abuse is definitely a bonus. And I
Yeah.
think that there's more and more clinicians coming on board now that, have this right basket of skills. But for a long time, it hasn't been there.
Yeah.
So I think the most exciting, I think the most significant finding in my research was that 75% of the survey participants met the clinical criteria for complex PTSD
Hmm.
as measured by a validated measure, but only 4% had been diagnosed with it.
Right.
And it frankly wasn't that far off for PTSD. For PTSD, 88% met the clinical
Mm.
criteria, but only about 8.5% had been diagnosed. So still, there's just a vast discrepancy,
Yeah. So for
which means you're
people,
not getting the right treatment.
right.
Yeah.
So for people who are listening who are going, "Oh fuck,
Mm-hmm.
that's me."
Mm-hmm.
Um
Mm-hmm.
I see myself in this conversation. I see my childhood, I see my adult
Mm-hmm.
relationships, I see my decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Um and I don't want to be ruled by this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um they need to look for a therapist who has experience working in trauma and
Mm-hmm.
who understands what CPTSD is and who understands narcissism, narcissistic abuse. And then what are the treatment modalities? And this is not a
Mm-hmm.
psychology podcast. This podcast is for
Mm-hmm.
empowering women over 40. But
Yes.
so many of us carry this shit around with
Mm-hmm.
us and let it rule our lives in ways that we are not conscious and aware of, and that we
Mm-hmm.
can get better from, that we can get
Oh my
relief
gosh.
from.
Yeah, it's an injury that can be healed. This is something that we have to work on, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, you'll get to a point where you'll never have a flashback again. But oh my gosh, the intensity and the length um of those really gnarly, experiences can be decreased dramatically, right? And it can really shift
Yeah.
your whole life. you know, a lot of women who have this are already hard chargers,
Yep.
right? But they still feel like they're not fully living their lives. They're still not alive. I call this living gray. You've gone, you've done all of the talk therapy, you've gone to, do the shamanic rituals,
Yeah.
everything that you've tried to feel better. And it's helped, no doubt you're made some progress, but there's still this something that's missing. And for me, when I got to that point personally and in my, working with clients, I really started to dig down on what actually works for women with
Yeah.
CPTSD. And there's a few things that you want to look for. You want to look for attachment focused EMDR. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a horrible name for a
Yes.
pretty brilliant therapy. The basic idea with EMDR is that traumatic experiences can get stuck in the brain and disrupt the way we process memories and we store them. And EMDR can help us actually reprocess these memories in a way that reduces their emotional
Mm.
intensity and negative impact. So basically, if you think about something that's happened to you in the past, and you just kind of think about it for a moment, a bad memory, you can almost feel that tingle of that memory somewhere in your body. If you just want to take a minute and notice that tingle.
Mm.
That is what happens whenever something reminds you, not even consciously, right? It can be a smell, it can be the sun, right, on a summer day. Anything that can bring up a memory or a feeling from something negative from the past, we can usually feel the associated sensation in our body. With EMDR, we focus on those memories or body sensations in
Mm-hmm.
case of emotional flashbacks. And we also identify how we're feeling about ourselves in that moment. So if we, for example, remember a time when, let's just say, we got left at home alone, to use an earlier example. Okay, where do you feel that in your body?
Mm.
I feel it in my chest and I feel nauseous. Okay. All right. What is the core belief? What do you believe about yourself as you think about that memory? I'm abandoned,
Mm.
right? And you're not just feeling that in the past, you're feeling abandoned in the present because your body is lighting up that way. And so, and then might ask in EMDR, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, how intense is that? You'd be surprised. Just memories from the past that you weren't even fully aware of a few minutes before, you can feel it a 9 out of 10
Mm.
sometimes in your body. With EMDR, we process that by using bilateral stimulation, all of this wonkety wonk terms, but it can be as simple as tapping back and forth. I use a little light bar where you kind of track your eyes back and forth. And there's something about that that relaxes the nervous system enough to process the trauma so that at the end of even just one session, what you were feeling at a 9, when you think about that memory the next time, it might only resonate as a 1 or a 2.
Mm.
Okay, so you're still having some, you could even call it negative or uneasy somatic sensations with that memory. But going from a 9 or a 10 down to a 1 or a 2, it is shocking how much that impacts your life
So
over
much
time.
relief. Yeah.
Yeah. And you just keep processing all the little things back and forth. I kind of call it like it's like building a basket. You get relief with kind of each strip that you weave in. But when you kind of get that whole basket full is when life really starts to feel fundamentally different. So EMDR is one modality I like to use. Psilocybin therapy is one that I've brought on. I've become such a believer in it. And I was one of the first therapists to get actually licensed to provide this therapy under a legal framework in Oregon.
That's amazing.
It's There's lots of places that are working towards this, but in Oregon we have it. We're just starting, and I'm just seeing really positive results with mushroom therapy.
Yeah.
So, and it can help us shift our perspectives and break free from those negative patterns.
Mm-hmm.
It's really important, especially for folks with complex trauma, to be pretty careful about the psychedelics they take and
Yeah.
in what settings. Right? This is not a Coachella experience. I mean,
No, and
that might do more harm than good.
yeah, we've had a
Hmm.
couple different people on the podcast talking
Yeah.
about therapeutic uses of psilocybin
Hmm.
and all the incredible things that are the breakthroughs that are happening in that
Hmm.
space. It's just so profound. And I mean, I came to psychedelics for fun, as a
Hmm.
teenager, and I still like it for
Sure.
fun. But
Yeah.
I'm super excited that there's something so organic and
Hmm.
non-harmful
Hmm.
that you can have an experience with that really
Hmm.
can help heal some of this deep,
Hmm.
deep stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so yeah, do you have any other questions about any of those things or?
No, I mean, I just think what's
Mhm,
important for listeners to know is like if they're hearing
mhm,
themselves in this conversation, that there are people out there like you, Michelle, who are doing incredible work and helping people get through some of this stuff so that they can make different decisions in their lives and
mhm.
so that they can get out of relationships that they're in that aren't healthy for
Mhm.
them and, so that they can feel amazing and have their own backs for the rest of
Yeah.
their lives because
Mhm.
there's nothing worse than that feeling of throwing yourself under the bus.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse
Mhm,
than all those things we have to do to survive difficult circumstances.
mhm.
And then we judge ourselves for that and
Mhm.
we feel ashamed of that and there are many more choices for us out there than
There
the way
definitely
we
are.
do things sort of automatically from childhood survival imprint.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so true.
Yeah.
Another thing a lot of us don't really realize is that depending on, our circumstances from childhood, our nervous systems aren't familiar with some really basic human needs. That feeling of being truly nurtured,
Mm.
truly protected, and guided,
Mm.
right?
Yep.
So another component of attachment focused EMDR is not just processing the trauma, but also building up the resources in the nervous system around things that many of us didn't get,
Mm.
right?
It's
So it's
huge.
about, yeah. So that's why an attachment focused EMDR therapist is particularly important.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Michelle, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everybody
Mm-hmm.
who comes on this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
which may not seem so relevant to this conversation, but I actually do think it is, which
Mm-hmm.
is, are there any deal terms in your life, literal or metaphoric, that you are ready to renegotiate?
I am ready to renegotiate. Um, I have done a really good job at blocking myself from, negative people and experiences,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm really ready to renegotiate how I experience joy.
Mm.
which is which can be kind of hard. I mean, I just got done talking about how the nervous system doesn't always know how to react, right, to some of
Yeah.
these more positive things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in kind of this next rung of my middle to late life, I am going to try to be unapologetically joyful and do
Mm.
things that I never would have otherwise done, in that direction.
I love that so much. That is so important. You get one life.
Mhm.
You get one life, and we are made for joy. We are made for pleasure. We are
Yeah.
made for fun, you know?
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I love hearing that.
Mm.
I think especially for those of us who are thinky and like
Mhm.
to go deep, counterbalancing that
Mhm.
with like lightheartedness and joy, like however you find it.
Yeah.
Holy moly, it's so important.
It's
Michelle,
the
your
best.
work is really profound and really
Thank you.
meaningful. And it's definitely going to help people who are listening to this episode, and also help Oxygen make more crime shows for women, which God knows we do not fucking need. Let's just have some shows about joy. That would be
Yes.
amazing. That's another podcast. But thank you so
Mhm.
much for coming on. I've
Thanks so
really,
much, Erin.
really
It's
learned a
just
lot.
such an honor. Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Hotter Than Ever. Did any of you see yourselves in some of the scenarios that Michelle described? I know I did. I would love to hear from you about that. I'd also love to answer any other questions you might have about mental health or how you've handled rough dynamics in the past. I'm not an expert, as you know, but I am very empathetic and opinionated. Do you have a question on a totally unrelated topic that you'd like to get my point of view on? I am eager to give you my very biased and totally unqualified feedback on a future episode of Hotter Than Ever Advice. So just DM us on Instagram at Hotter Than Ever Pod, or call and leave a voicemail, or text your question to the Hotter Than Ever Hottie hotline at 323-844-2303. Hotter Than Ever is produced by Erica Gerard and Podkit Productions. Our associate producer is Melody Carey. Music is by Chris Keating with vocals by Isa Fernandez. I will see you next week, you hottie.